Dr. Darius Rejali, the author of Torture and Democracy. We've got some callers for you, sir. But first, just a couple of points that we were discussing during the break, and that I really want to bring out. Torture not only destroys the person being tortured. We opened the show with that. It not only destroys the culture or harms the culture. We've seen that, from what happened in Chile under Pinochet to the Nazis. Just pick a country. It happened in your grandfather's country, in Iran. Mm-hmm. It destroys the torturers.
Yeah, and it gives bad info. And the really unknown part is how much it destroys torturers. Torture produces something that we all recognize as atrocity-related trauma. Soldiers who are actually asked to do it, the lower down you are in the chain of command, the more you're forced to do it, the more you have higher rates of burnout, alcoholism, suicide, etc. We've done studies of Greek torturers, Brazilian torturers, French torturers. We're finding pretty similar results. Basically, the conditions are not good. So they have a lot of intra-family violence, things like that. Mm-hmm. Additionally, I think not only does it sort of produce terrible sort of post-traumatic stress disorder, but even if it doesn't do that, it produces burnout. Most people forget that torture is a labor-intensive activity. When we interview the torturers, they basically said, God, I wish I was like James Bond. I could go out on a death squad and kill people. I wouldn't have to take my work home with me. Mm. But they have to take their work home with them. And eventually torture produces toxic levels of guilt and shame, which then sort of destroys the guys. The other thing to say about the torturers is it teaches them incredibly bad habits. And those who don't develop these symptoms go on, if you think about it, if you're coming back from a war, you're an MP, what kind of skills do you have? Many of them go on who are torturers will think, well, why not become private security? Why not become a policeman?
In other words, people internalize this behavior in one of two ways. They either internalize it as, excuse me, what I did was terrible, in which case they have post-traumatic stress disorder and they're more likely to be depressed and suicidal. Pardon me, which is one of the horrors of what Cheney and this administration have inflicted on our troops. Or they internalize it as, that was a good thing I did, and I need to keep doing it. And, for example, there was you refer to this period in Chicago, the Chicago torture crises of 1971 to 1993. Tell us about that.
Well, in Chicago, right now there's a multi-million-dollar series of suits against the city of Chicago because it appears in Area 2 implicating close to 50 detectives, including possibly the second in command of the Chicago PD. These cases all seem to stem from torture of African Americans and Hispanics in the south side of Chicago. Now, when you study the torture techniques that appear in Chicago in this period, and these have been carefully documented, they first appeared in Vietnam. And a lot of these techniques appeared to have been introduced into the police force by soldiers who had actually served in Vietnam. Same thing with waterboarding. We got that in police lockups all through the American South in the 1910s, 1920s, immediately after the Philippine insurgency, where so many Spanish-American War, where so many soldiers learned how to do this stuff. So they came home and they brought it with them. Torture isn't just a policy. You have to recognize that torture is a practice, and people learn it, and it has a 20-year shadow. I think sort of those are the things. And as for I just want to say there's this great radio show on American Radio Works called Whatever Happened to Sergeant Gray, which describes a tank unit in southern Iraq, which was forced to do prison duty, which undoubtedly involved torture, and what happened to the entire unit. No one ordered these people to do all these things, but the rates of suicide, alcoholism, sort of those kinds of things, those are characteristic of what's going on with this unit.
So we're not. So the Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld crowd, they're not only getting bad intelligence. First of all, it's largely useless. Number two, they're destroying people. In some cases, bad guys, but in some cases, perfectly innocent people. They're turning them into furniture. I mean, they're destroying them in ways that we can't even imagine.
Yeah, I mean, there's a selection problem. It's pretty obvious that many innocent people get locked up within the system. And I guess I would put it this way. None of us really knows how well torture worked, we really look forward to the data. Because in the past, when the data dumps have finally happened, like they did in the Irish or the French cases, they've never been substantiated. But this is one thing we can all say. Some of the data that took us into this war, for example, the connection of weapons of mass destruction to al-Qaeda from Iraq,
right.
those things came from coerced interrogations involving Yusuf Sheikh al-Libi, and some of the actual prosecution of the war was driven by coerced information. So none of us know how much torture produced in terms of saving lives, but we know how many lives torture took. Just look at the data.
So it's not only producing bad data, it's not only destroying the democracy, the culture that it came from, it's not only a recruiting tool for our enemies, it is also destroying the torturers, and this 20-year shadow, it's eventually going to come back to America, and it's going to harm our own culture, our own right here.
There's no sharp distinction between domestic and international torture. It comes home.
Let's pick up some phone calls on this. Michael in Raleigh, North Carolina. Michael, you're on with Darius Rejali.
Dr. Rejali, I'm loving the conversation that you're having because you're getting into some areas I thought really need to be addressed to turn this thing around. When I look at, there's about a split between Americans on whether the enhanced, quote-unquote enhanced interrogation techniques were about right or not among the American people. You got to convince people, just like Obama having people behind him is driving his ability to get things done, until you turn the tide of people in America against this thing. When people think about the beheadings that they see, about the way these people behave, they don't have a problem, really, with people that are so atrocious being even tortured. I don't believe in torture, but it is kind of hard to feel sympathy for certain of these people when you hear about it being done. So what you have to do is concentrate on the issues, not about how bad it is for that person and how it affects them for a lifetime. People could care less about those people suffering. What you have to do is talk about how it's a liability, like you just were, when it comes to how it affects the people that come back home, how it impacts their lives, and their family, and the police, when they become police officers, or how they may be depressed. You have to talk about how it affects us negative.
Yeah.
Forget about how it affects.
Excellent point, Michael. Other than the fact that a lot of the people who are tortured and turned into vegetables were innocent to begin with. But Dr. Rejali, you want to address the issue of public opinion in the United States?
It's actually really a remarkable thing. There have been close to 30,000 Americans in close to 30 different polls in which people have pushed them very hard to say yes to torture by identifying ticking time bomb questions or telling them that torture will work and produce accurate information. And there's a fundamental misperception. Actually, this has never changed. American public opinion, there has never been a pro-torture majority in America. Not a single poll from a major polling organization, not even Fox, could get more than 44% for torture on this. The new polls can get the high numbers because they drop the word torture and they put in harsh interrogation. The vaguer you are in the wording of a poll, the more support you can get. Conversely, if you ask Americans, would you support waterboarding if it saved an American terrorist attack? Then torture collapses. Only 20% support that. There have also been polls of U.S. soldiers serving in Iraq, both Marines and regular Army soldiers. And the highest numbers, and they're asked, would you torture to save a fellow soldier's life? And the regular Army says 35% would, i.e., close to two-thirds of all American soldiers serving in Iraq in the 2006 military survey said they would not. So there's a fundamental misperception that's been sort of generated by politicians and journalists about where the public norm is. In fact, we've just tested this out in a major poll, and it seems the more pro-torture you are, the more of a mistake you make. You think that 2 to 3 times as many people are with you than ever were
so the Sean Hannitys of the world represent a very small minority, or at least a significant one-third minority, but they think that they represent a majority.
And what this does is it produces what's famously known as the bystander effect. It's not that Americans are indifferent. It's actually that they don't want to be the fool because, gosh, if everybody else is against torture, for torture, then why should I do it? It scares everybody. Thanks to President Obama, we can now actually say, look, here are the polls. We're going on.
Yeah.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.